The flash of red and blue lights painted the long needles of the Carolina pines in strokes of panic and authority. Two sheriff's cruisers were parked askew on the quiet cul-de-sac, their presence a screaming violation of the neighborhood's carefully curated tranquility. Between them, a woman stood with her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to hold her own skeleton together. This was Brenda Mae Thompson, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and right now, her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated triumph. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the brand-new wrought-iron gate blocking the entrance to my driveway. My gate. The one I just finished installing 3 hours ago. That is an unapproved obstruction on a designated access easement, officer, she said, her voice carrying across the humid evening air, sharp enough to cut glass. It was the voice of a person who had never been told no and intended to keep her record clean. The air smelled of hot asphalt, ozone from the light bars, and Brenda's cloying gardenia perfume. A young deputy, barely old enough to need a shave, approached me. He had that apologetic but firm look cops get when they're caught in the middle of a petty neighborhood war. "Sir, I understand you're the homeowner, Mr. Hayes. Ma'am here says you've illegally blocked her access. We need you to open the gate." Brenda's smirk widened. This was her moment, the culmination of months of her escalating harassment campaign, now validated by the flashing lights of the law. This was the checkmate she'd been planning, her illegal gate takedown, sanctioned by the county. I just stood there on my side of the fence, the cool metal of the gate's lockbox under my hand. I didn't look at the deputy, I didn't even look at Brenda. I just held up a single folded piece of paper. A certified plat map, fresh from the county records office. "With all due respect, officer," I said, my voice calm and even. "This woman has no authority here, not anymore." I unfolded the map. You see, she's not just trespassing on my property. I let my eyes finally meet hers, letting her see the cold, hard satisfaction I'd been saving for this exact moment. She's also standing on it. Brenda's victorious smirk didn't just falter, it shattered. Wait, what just happened? Her mind was visibly struggling to catch up. And that's when I knew the war wasn't over, but the final battle had just begun, and she had already lost. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. It all started 6 months earlier, with the smell of damp soil and the soft sigh of my father's oxygen machine. I'd moved back to the house I grew up in, a rambling old place on a 2-acre lot at the very end of Whispering Pines. Drive. My father, a man who once built that house with his own 2 hands, was now losing his fight with time, his mind a flickering map of memories. I came home to be his cartographer, to help him navigate the fading landscapes of his own life. My career as a military surveyor had taught me to understand the world through lines, boundaries, and immutable points of reference. It was a skill that, I would soon learn, was more valuable than any weapon. The property was an island of history in a sea of modern beige conformity. Our lot was grandfathered in long before the developer carved up the surrounding forest and the HOA was born, a fact that seemed to be a personal affront to Brenda Mae Thompson. She arrived on my second day, gliding up my gravel driveway in a BYE silver Lexus SUV that purred with smug efficiency. She carried a wicker basket filled with artisanal jams and a thick, professionally printed booklet of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It felt less like a welcome and more like a summons. "Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this HOA power reaches." "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mark," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching the cold, assessing chips of her blue eyes. She was in her late 50s, dressed in crisp white linen, her blonde hair sprayed into a helmet of unflappable perfection. The only thing that ever seemed out of place was the way she would nervously twist the pearl necklace at her throat whenever she was about to enforce a rule. "We are so glad the old Hayes place is finally getting some attention." The air was thick with the scent of pine needles baking in the sun and the faint, sweet smell of the honeysuckle climbing our old split-rail fence. She eyed that fence like it had personally insulted her. That fencing is, of course, non-compliant with current aesthetic standards, she'd mused, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the cover of the CC&Rs. But we can discuss that later. We like to give new residents time to acclimate. It was a threat wrapped in a velvet ribbon. The first official salvo came a week later. A letter printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock slid through my mail slot. The paper felt heavy, important, and smelled faintly of her gardenia perfume. It was a formal notice of violation, grass height exceeding the 4-inch maximum. I looked out at my lawn. It was a healthy green carpet. I went to the old workshop my dad built, the air inside thick with the ghosts of sawdust and old motor, oil, and found his old yardstick. I walked out into the yard, knelt down, and measured 3.5 inches. Tops. This wasn't about grass. This was a probe, a test of my defenses. As a surveyor, I operate on precision. Her claim was factually, measurably false. I took a photo with the yardstick clearly visible, printed it, and mailed it back to the HOA board via certified mail, along with a polite letter stating the facts. I heard the satisfying thump of the postal clerk's stamp on the return receipt, a small official sound of defiance. That little piece of paper, my proof of delivery, was my first piece of ammunition. I didn't know then how much I would need. Her next attack was on the workshop itself. It was old, weathered, but structurally sound. It sat near the edge of our property line, closer than modern setback rules would allow. Another letter arrived, this one more aggressive. It cited county codes and HOA bylaws, demanding the structure be removed within 30 days at my expense, calling it an unauthorized and derelict outbuilding. The cost would be thousands. My father, from his armchair, just looked toward the workshop, a flicker of confusion and hurt in his eyes. He'd built that place to store the tools that built our lives. Brenda showed up the next day, clipboard in hand, to document the violation for the board's legal filing. She stood on the edge of my lawn, the afternoon sun glinting off her pearl necklace as she adjusted it. She was in her element. It's a simple matter of compliance, Mark. The rules are the rules. They protect our property values. I walked out to meet her, the dry grass crunching under my boots. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had something better than volume. I had data. Brenda, you're citing setback rules that were established when the HOA was formed. Exactly, she said, smiling that cold reptilian smile. And this thing is in clear violation. This was the moment. The first time I deployed a real weapon. Actually, I said, keeping my tone conversational, according to North Carolina General Statute, paragraph 47F3102D, also known as the Planned Community Act, any improvements or structures that existed prior to the recording of the declaration, that is, the formation of the HOA, are grandfathered in. They're exempt from the rules you're trying to enforce. I paused, letting it land. My father got the building permit for this shed in 1978. I have the county record. The Whispering Pines HOA was legally established on May 12, 1991. So you see, your entire claim is legally baseless. The color drained from her face. Her hand went to her necklace, twisting the pearls furiously. She had expected a shouting match, an emotional outburst. She got a calm, factual recitation of state law. She sputtered for a moment, trying to find a foothold on the legal high ground I had just claimed. Well, the aesthetics are still a concern, she managed, her voice suddenly thin. That may be, I said, turning to walk back to my house. But it's a concern you have no legal authority over. Have a nice day. I had won the battle over the shed, but I knew I'd just kicked the hornet's nest. The war was escalating. Her campaign moved from official channels to a guerrilla insurgency of whispers and digital shrapnel. In the community Facebook group, I saw her carefully worded posts. Just a reminder to our newer residents about maintaining the community's peaceful character, followed by a vague complaint about unusual noises at odd hours. She was talking about my father's oxygen concentrator, a machine that hummed with the gentle rhythm of his breathing. The sound was barely audible from my own porch, let alone from the street. But in Brenda's narrative, I was a disruptive nuisance, an uncooperative outsider tarnishing their suburban paradise. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it's yours too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line. The final flashpoint was the gate. With Dad's dementia progressing, he'd started to wander. A few times I'd found him halfway down the driveway, confused, looking for a wife who had been gone for 10 years. For his safety, I needed to secure the property. A gate was the only real solution. I drew up a simple, elegant design, black wrought iron, nothing ostentatious, and submitted the plans to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee as required. The denial came back in less than 48 hours. The reason cited was a single, infuriatingly vague phrase. The proposed design is not in keeping with the aesthetic harmony of the community. There was no detail, no suggestion for revision, just a flat, absolute no. The letter was signed by the two members of the ARC, Brenda Mae Thompson and a Janice Krieger, who I quickly discovered was Brenda's first cousin. I was furious. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was a power play. She was using the rules not to maintain order, but to punish my defiance. My father's safety was on the line. I spent the next 2 nights with a thermos of black coffee, the glow of my laptop, illuminating a stack of county zoning maps and a printout of the full HOA bylaws. The smell of stale coffee and my own simmering rage filled my office. The paragraphs of the bylaws were a dense jungle of legalese, but as a surveyor, I knew how to read the map. I was looking for a loophole, a weakness in her fortress of rules. And then I found it. It was in Article 5, Section 2. The Architectural Review Committee, ARC, shall be composed of three members in good standing, appointed by the board. 3 members. I cross-referenced it with the HOA's public filings on the Secretary of State's website. For the last 2 years since the previous member had moved away, the ARC had only listed 2 members, Brenda and her cousin. They'd never appointed a third. She was running an illegal committee. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. This was more than a loophole. It was a legal cannonball. I drafted an appeal. I didn't just argue the merits of my gate. I challenged the very legitimacy of the committee that had denied it. I cited the bylaws. The HOA's Architectural Review Committee is improperly constituted, I wrote. The governing documents clearly require 3 members for the committee to have a quorum and therefore the authority to render any decision. As public records show, the ARC has only 2 members. Its decision to deny my application is procedurally invalid, null, and void. I sent it to the entire HOA board, not just Brenda. I wanted them all on the record. 2 days later, I received a seething phone call from her. How dare you question our procedures? This is nothing but a transparent attempt to bully the board. Brenda, it's not bullying, it's bylaws, I said calmly, the receiver cool against my ear. Your committee is illegal. Any decision it makes won't stand up in court. Approve the gate, or I'll be forced to file for a declaratory judgment, and we can let a judge explain the rules to you. I'll also be sure to mention this procedural lapse at the next annual meeting. I'm sure the other homeowners would be very interested to learn that their applications have been ruled on by an illegitimate committee. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with her fury. I could almost hear the pearls of her necklace clinking together as she strangled them. A day later, I received a 1-sentence email. The board has rescinded the ARC's denial. There was no apology, no admission of fault, but it was a victory, a temporary one. I hired a contractor, and the gate was installed the following week. It was beautiful, strong, and most importantly, it kept my father safe. But as I watched Brenda's Lexus crawl past my house each day, her eyes burning holes into my new gate, I noticed something else. Her obsession was shifting. It wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about the one next to mine. Lot 34. A 1-acre parcel of undeveloped land, overgrown with wild grass and dotted with towering longleaf pines. It sat between my property and the next house down. Brenda had been talking for years about the HOA acquiring it to build a community meditation garden. She'd organized volunteer cleanup days where she'd have residents pick up trash and pull weeds on the property, an act I initially saw as civic-minded. But now I saw it differently. I saw her standing at the edge of the lot, staring into the trees, not with the look of a community organizer, but with the look of a prospector staring at a claim. There was a hunger there. One evening, a massive storm rolled through, the sky turning a bruised purple gray. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets, smelling of wet earth and pine. I saw a flash of headlights and looked out to see Brenda's SUV parked by the vacant lot. She was out of the car, getting soaked, walking the property line with a tape measure, her hair plastered to her skull. It wasn't the behavior of a prim and proper HOA president. It was the behavior of someone desperate, someone running out of time. There was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen before, a crack in her armor of self-righteousness. And I saw her flinch once at a neighborhood barbecue when someone mentioned Clearwater Development, the company that had originally built Whispering Pines decades ago before going bankrupt. It was a tell, a breadcrumb on the map. My military training taught me to exploit an enemy's weakness. Her weakness was Lot 34. That night I went back to my office. I fired up the county's online GIS mapping system and the Register of Deeds database. I wasn't just looking for my own property records anymore. I was launching a full-scale reconnaissance mission into hers. The HOA didn't own Lot 34. That much was clear. So who did? The records were a tangled mess. The owner was listed as Clearwater Development, LLC. But the LLC had been administratively dissolved by the state in 1999. Its assets were supposed to have been liquidated, but somehow, this one parcel had been forgotten, left in legal limbo for over 20 years. A ghost on the county map. This is where Brenda's plan became clear. She wasn't trying to buy the lot, she was trying to take it. I dug into North Carolina property law. I found what she was banking on, the doctrine of adverse possession. Squatters' rights. If you openly and continuously occupy or maintain a piece of property for an uninterrupted 20-year period, you can petition a court to grant you the title. Her community cleanup days, her constant talk of the HOA's garden, it was all a performance. She was manufacturing a history of HOA control over the land, trying to run out the clock on the 20-year statute. But my research showed she'd only been president and started her maintenance for the last 7 years. She was a long way from her goal, but there had to be a faster way. A dissolved LLC might be a ghost, but every ghost has a history. I spent the next 48 hours on a deep dive, cross-referencing old business filings, tax records, and archived newspaper articles. The coffee went cold in my mug as I fell down a rabbit hole of digital paperwork. Finally, at 3 a.m., my office lit only by the monitor's glow, I found it. The name of the last registered agent for Clearwater Development, a Franklin Murdoch. A quick public records search revealed he had passed away in 2012, but he had one surviving heir, a son. Arthur Murdoch, age 78, living in a quiet retirement community in Asheville, 5 hours away. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the flank, the unguarded approach to Brenda's fortress. The next morning, I made the call. Arthur was confused at first, but when I explained that his father's defunct company might still technically own a forgotten parcel of land, he was intrigued. He had no attachment to it, no idea it even existed. I made him an offer, $5,000 cash for a quitclaim deed, transferring any and all interest in the property to me. That was far less than market value, but for him, it was found money for a property he never knew he had. He agreed instantly. 2 weeks later, a thick cardstock envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside, signed and notarized, was the deed. The legal description for Lot 34 was there in crisp black ink. My hands shook slightly as I read it. The feeling was electric, a surge of tactical victory. I now owned the very land Brenda had coveted, the centerpiece of her scheme for ultimate control. But as my eyes scanned the final paragraph of the deed, a standard boilerplate section detailing all appurtenant rights and easements, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the arcane language of property law, was a mention of a 50-foot wide ingress, egress, and utility easement that had been granted to the original owner of Lot 34 back in 1988, 3 years before the HOA even existed. an easement that cut directly across another parcel. I pulled up the original subdivision plat map from my files, my fingers flying across the keyboard. My surveyor's eyes traced the old ink lines, following the callouts and boundaries. I located Lot 34. Then I traced the path of the forgotten easement described in my new deed. It ran from the edge of my new property, straight across the manicured, award-winning front lawn of the adjacent lot. The lot with the sprawling rose bushes, the perfectly edged walkway, and the ornate custom-built mailbox. Brenda Mae Thompson's lot. She thought she was fighting me for control of a gate. She had no idea I now owned a private road through the middle of her prize-winning petunias. And the first hole was going to be her absolute, unconditional surrender. Holding the deed to Lot 34 felt like holding a primed grenade. The knowledge of the easement cutting through Brenda's pristine lawn was a secret weapon of immense power, and my military training screamed one thing: you never deploy your best asset until the battlefield is perfectly prepared. She would make the next move. She had to. People like Brenda Thompson can't comprehend defeat. They can only process it as a temporary setback, requiring overwhelming retaliation. I folded the deed, slid it into a fireproof safe behind a false panel in my father's old office, and I waited. The air in the house was still, thick with the scent of lemon polish and old books, a stark contrast to the storm I knew was gathering. It took her precisely 36 hours to launch her counteroffensive. The first wave arrived on a Monday, another cream-colored envelope, but this one felt different. Heavier. Inside was a formal notice of a $5,000 fine. The charge: failure to cure a violation following a board-level reversal. The letter, dripping with legalese, argued that when the board rescinded the ARC's denial of my gate, it was an act of provisional grace, and that I had failed to resubmit the plan with community-friendly aesthetic modifications, which were, of course, never defined or requested. It was nonsense. A fabrication designed to bury me in fines and force me to tear down the gate that was keeping my father safe. The second wave hit on Tuesday. A letter not from the HOA, but from a law firm, Hemlock & Associates. It was a formal threat of legal action, promising to place a lien on my property if the fine wasn't paid and the gate wasn't removed within 10 days. The lawyer's name was Todd Hemlock, and a quick search revealed he was the go-to guy for aggressive HOA litigation in the state. He was a shark, and Brenda had just pointed him in my direction. The paper had a slick, glossy feel, a stark contrast to the homespun tyranny of Brenda's personal letters. This was corporate warfare now. Wednesday brought the escalation I had been dreading. I went to take my father for a short walk, but the gate wouldn't open. The electronic keypad was dead. When I got closer, I saw the source of the problem. Every seam, every button, the card reader slot, all of it was filled with a clear, hardened substance, superglue. A thick, chemical smell of cyanoacrylate hung in the humid air. It was amateurish, petty, and utterly infuriating. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was sabotage. It was a direct threat to my ability to care for my father. If there had been an emergency, we would have been trapped. My simmering anger began to boil. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. That was her mistake. She had moved from procedural warfare, a game I could play and win, to direct action. She had made it personal. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to map the terrain of her little kingdom and find all of its weaknesses. My first step was to talk to the neighbors. An army of one is just a target. An army of many is a revolution. My first visit was to George Henderson, a widower in his late 70s who lived 3 houses down. His yard was a masterpiece, a riot of color and life that stood in vibrant defiance of the neighborhood's beige palette. The air around his property smelled sweet, a mix of blooming roses and rich, turned earth. I found him kneeling in his front garden, gently tying a heavy tomato vine to a stake. His hands, though wrinkled, were steady and sure. "She's fining you for these?" I asked, gesturing to the rows of spectacular heirloom tomatoes, some as large as softballs. George sighed, wiping a line of sweat from his brow with the back of a soil-stained glove. $50 a week? Violation 7.4, unapproved agricultural activity visible from the street. I've won best garden in the county 3 years running with these tomatoes. Now she calls them a violation. He looked at me, his eyes tired but clear. I sent her a copy of the county award. She sent me back a picture of the rule in the CC&Rs with the line highlighted. There was a deep-seated injustice in his voice, the frustration of a man whose passion was being reclassified as a crime. 2 doors down from him lived the Garcias, a young couple with 2 small children. Their lawn was immaculate, their hedges perfectly trimmed. They were the model HOA citizens, yet they too lived in fear. I spoke to Maria Garcia as she pushed her 5-year-old daughter on a small, lonely-looking swing in their backyard. We wanted to get her a real swing set, Maria said, her voice barely a whisper, as if Brenda could hear us from across the neighborhood. We submitted the plans, a nice wooden one. The ARC, Brenda, denied it. The shade of green on the slide wasn't on the pre-approved color palette. Did she give you the palette? I asked. Maria shook her head, the motion filled with a kind of exhausted disbelief. No, she just said it was wrong. We asked for the list of approved colors and she never replied. My husband, he didn't want to make waves. So we got this. She gestured to the single plastic swing hanging from a small metal frame. It was a sad monument to defeated joy. This was Brenda's MO. Not just enforcement, but subjugation. She didn't want compliance. She wanted control. Her power wasn't in the rules themselves, but in their arbitrary and selective application. She was a tyrant ruling a kingdom of lawn ornaments and paint swatches. And I realized my fight for a gate was the same as George's fight for his tomatoes and the Garcia's fight for a simple swing set. My reconnaissance moved from front porches to the county courthouse. The Register of Deeds office was a quiet, sterile place that smelled of old paper and dust. For the next week, I spent my afternoons there, scrolling through microfiche, pulling up digital records, and piecing together the financial and legal history of the Whispering Pines HOA. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was an operative gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. I analyzed every lien Brenda had filed, every lawsuit she had initiated. A pattern emerged. The targets were almost always elderly residents, young families, or newcomers, people less likely to have the resources or the will to fight back. It was a clear strategy of predatory enforcement. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. And then, buried deep in the original 1991, developer covenants filed by Clearwater Development, I found the bombshell. It was in a dense, almost unreadable section on financial governance. I had to read it 3 times to fully grasp its significance. It was a clause stating that all funds collected for capital improvements and long-term reserves were to be held in a separate, state-chartered, interest-bearing reserve account. Crucially, it forbade the commingling of reserve funds with the general operating budget. My heart began to beat faster. I pulled the last 3 years of the HOA's annual budget, reports which they were legally required to make available to homeowners upon request. The numbers were a mess. There was a line item for reserve contribution, but there was no separate accounting for a reserve fund. All the money, dues, fines, fees, flowed into one single pot, and flowing out of that pot were line items for landscape enhancements, common areas, legal retainers, and administrative consulting. Brenda wasn't just using the general fund to pay her lawyer to harass residents. She was almost certainly dipping into the reserve funds meant for long-term projects, like repaving the roads or replacing the community pool liner. She was using the community's emergency savings as her own personal slush fund. This wasn't just a violation of the bylaws, it was a breach of her fiduciary duty. This was a financial scandal. It was illegal. This was the weapon I needed. A weapon that could not only dethrone her, but could potentially expose her to civil and even criminal liability. I was ready to draft a letter to the State Attorney General's office. I had the evidence, the paper trail that would bring her entire corrupt empire crashing down. But before I could fire my shot, she launched a preemptive strike with a weapon I never saw coming. She used her husband. Brenda's husband was a slick, glad-handing real estate developer named Ron Thompson, who had recently been elected to the city council. It was her ultimate power lever. An official notice from the city of Oak Ridge arrived, in every mailbox in Whispering Pines. The letterhead was stark, official, and terrifying. It announced an immediate code compliance inquiry for the entire subdivision, citing an anonymous but alarming number of complaints regarding unpermitted structures and property neglect. It was a thinly veiled dragnet, and it was aimed directly at me and my allies. The inquiry would reevaluate all properties, with special attention given to structures that predated the city's annexation of the area 10 years ago. In other words, grandfather clauses were now under review. My father's workshop, George Henderson's beloved greenhouse, they were all targets again. She had bypassed the HOA's authority entirely and was now wielding the full, intimidating power of the city government against us. It was a brilliant, vicious move. My evidence of financial misconduct suddenly felt slow and bureaucratic compared to the immediate threat of city inspectors and demolition orders. She had changed the battlefield, and I was suddenly outmaneuvered. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me the win of my life. For a day, I felt a cold knot of despair in my stomach. How could I fight City Hall? But then the anger returned, burning away the doubt. She had overplayed her hand. By expanding the conflict, she had exposed her tyranny to the whole community. She had united us. I printed copies of the city's notice and went back to George and the Garcias. I showed them the financial records, the evidence of her mismanagement. I laid out the whole strategy. She's using the city to silence us. Because she knows we have her cornered, I explained, the papers spread out on the Garcias' dining room table. The air smelled of coffee and the faint, sweet scent of Maria's daughter's bubble bath from the hallway. A complaint to the AG will take months. We need to act now. We need to remove her from power. The HOA bylaws had one more emergency: break for homeowners, the right to call a special meeting of the members. It required a petition signed by at least 25% of the homeowners. At that meeting, we could hold a vote of no confidence and elect a new board. For the next 3 days, we became a grassroots campaign. George, with his quiet dignity, was surprisingly persuasive with the older residents. The Garcias, who had been too afraid to even ask for a swing set, found their courage and were incredibly effective with the young families. I handled the legal arguments, showing up at doorsteps with my binder of evidence, explaining the financial issues, the illegal committee, the pattern of harassment. The smell of freshly cut grass and chlorinated pool water followed us as we walked the pristine streets of Brenda's kingdom, sowing the seeds of rebellion. Some doors were shut in our faces. Some people were too afraid. But for every one of those, there were 3 who listened, their eyes widening with anger as they realized the scope of Brenda's corruption. They signed. We got the signatures in 72 hours. We had our meeting. The community clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with tension and the smell of cheap coffee brewed in the community kitchen. It was a sea of nervous, angry faces. Brenda and the rest of the board sat at a long table at the front, flanked by their lawyer, Todd Hemlock, who looked like a smug vulture in a tailored suit. Brenda appeared calm, imperious, radiating a confidence that told me she thought she had this under control. She probably assumed this was just about fines and gates, a petty squabble she could easily quash. After the procedural droning, the floor was open to me. I walked to the podium, my heart pounding. This was it. The entire community was watching. The next 60 seconds will show you exactly how a single document can destroy an entire HOA. My name is Mark Hayes, I began, my voice steady, and we are here tonight because our HOA is fundamentally broken. It's been run not as a community, but as a personal fiefdom. We've been subjected to selective enforcement, harassment, and financial mismanagement. I heard murmurs of agreement. Brenda simply smiled, a tight, condescending little smile. She whispered something to her lawyer. I have evidence that our reserve funds are being improperly used, I continued. I have proof the architectural committee was operating illegally. But I want to talk about the root of the problem. I want to talk about why our president has been so obsessed with one particular piece of land, Lot 34, and why she has been so hostile to anyone who stands in her way. I glanced at Brenda. The smile was gone. Her hand went to her pearl necklace, pulled a small remote from my pocket. I did some research into the history of our neighborhood, into the original developer, Clearwater Development. At the mention of the name, Brenda flinched, a visible, undeniable reaction. The vulnerability I had spotted months ago was now a gaping wound. They went bankrupt, as we all know, I said, turning to the projector screen behind the board table, but the reasons why are very interesting. I clicked the button. An image, fuzzy and grainy, filled the screen. It was a scanned newspaper article from 1998. The headline was stark: Clearwater foreman accused in embezzlement scandal. And there, in the black and white photo, was a much younger Brenda, standing beside a man in a hard hat with a desperate, guilty look on his face. The man was her husband, Ron Thompson. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Phones were suddenly raised, their flashes popping like small explosions, capturing the image on the screen and, more importantly, the look of pure, unadulterated horror that had replaced Brenda's mask of control. Her face was white, her mouth agape. Her carefully constructed world, her reign of suburban terror, was vaporizing in the flash of a dozen cell phone cameras. The scandal she had spent 20 years burying was now the main event. The flash from the cell phone cameras had a strange, percussive effect, like a volley of small arms fire in the dead silent room. Each pop of light was another nail being hammered into the coffin of Brenda Mae Thompson's reign. The image on the screen behind her, a ghost from a 20-year-old scandal, held the entire room in a state of suspended shock. The air, which moments before had smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat, now tasted metallic, electric with revelation. Brenda's face was a crumbling mask of porcelain, her carefully constructed reality shattering in real time. Her lawyer, Todd Hemlock, was the first to recover. He leaped to his feet, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. "Objection!" he yelled, as if they were in a courtroom and not a clubhouse meeting room with a linoleum floor. "This is an outrageous and irrelevant ad hominem. Attack! A desperate smear tactic that has no bearing on this meeting or Mr. Hayes' long list of violations." But it was too late. The spell of her authority was broken. You could feel the shift in the room, the tectonic plates of neighborhood, power grinding into a new alignment. It was Brenda's own voice, however, that sealed her fate. She pushed herself to her feet, her hands gripping the podium so hard her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. Her arrogance, the very source of her power, became her undoing. There was no apology, no explanation, only pure, undiluted rage. "He's right," she shrieked, her voice cracking, raw and ugly. "It is irrelevant. My husband's business 20 years ago has nothing to do with my tireless, thankless work to protect the property values of this community. This man," she pointed a trembling finger at me, "is the problem. He is a delinquent who erects illegal structures, who thumbs his nose at the rules that protect all of you. He is the one bringing scandal and decay to Whispering Pines." A low grumble rolled through the crowd. She had completely misread the room. They weren't looking at me as the problem. They were looking at the newspaper photo of her husband, the accused embezzler, and then at the HOA's financials I had mentioned, and they were finally connecting the dots. I let her tirade hang in the air for a moment before I spoke, my voice calm and measured in the wake of her storm. "Brenda is right about one thing," I said, and a confused silence fell. "The past is the past. So let's talk about right now. Let's talk about our money." I clicked the remote. The newspaper article vanished, replaced by a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a screenshot of the HOA's budget report with the single, commingled bank account total. On the right was the North Carolina Planned Community Act, Statute Paragraph 47F3-107, with the section on the mandatory separation of reserve and operating funds highlighted in bright yellow. "This is our money," I said, pointing to the budget. "And this is the law," I said, pointing to the statute. The law says that the money we all pay for long-term repairs, to fix our roads, our pool, our clubhouse roof, must be kept in a separate, protected account. It is a breach of fiduciary duty to use that money for day-to-day operations. I picked up a printout. Yet, in the last 12 months, our single account has paid over $20,000 to Mr. Hemlock's law firm. For what? To send threatening letters to George Henderson for growing tomatoes. George stood up from his seat in the front row, his presence quiet but powerful. "I've lived here 30 years, he said, his voice resonating with simple decency. "My tomatoes never hurt a soul." He sat back down, but his point had landed like a bombshell. "Our money," I continued, my voice rising with indignation, "was used to try and put a lien on my property for installing a gate to keep my ailing father safe. It was used to fund a campaign of harassment, not community improvement." I looked directly at the other board members, the treasurer and the secretary, who were now looking anywhere but at me. This isn't just bad management. This is a potential violation of state law, a scandal that could result in massive fines and leave our entire community in financial ruin. Brenda slammed her hand on the podium. "Lies! These are complex financial matters you couldn't possibly understand." "Oh, I understand them," I said. "And I think everyone here understands what it means when someone is using your savings account to pay their credit card bills. But even this financial disaster isn't the real reason for Brenda's obsession. The real reason is her desperate, illegal attempt to get her hands on a piece of property. A property she has been using our money to landscape and maintain under the lie that it was a community project. I'm talking about Lot 34. A wave of murmurs went through the room. Everyone knew about Brenda's meditation garden project. She scoffed, a strangled, ugly sound. "The meditation garden is a gift to this community, a place of peace and tranquility that he is trying to jeopardize." "It's hard to jeopardize something you own, Brenda," I said quietly. The room fell silent again. I held up the notarized quitclaim deed, its crisp cardstock a stark white flag of victory under the fluorescent lights. "I purchased all rights and title to Lot 34 2 weeks ago from the estate of the original owner. It's my property now." For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Then, the room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions, staring at the deed in my hand as if it were a holy relic. Brenda's composure finally, completely shattered. This was the one outcome she had never planned for. Her long con, her 20-year play of adverse possession had been dismantled by a single legal transaction. "No!" she screamed, her voice a raw nerve. "That is impossible. That is HOA common land. I'll sue you into the ground. I will have you arrested for trespassing the first time you set a single foot on it. That land is ours." And there it was, the final fatal error. She had walked straight into the kill box I'd prepared. "That's going to be difficult, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. I clicked the remote one last time. The screen behind her changed to a high-resolution image of the official county plat map. It was a web of black lines and property boundaries, a language I understood better than English. A bright red line glowed on the screen. "This is a map. It operates on facts, not on opinions or on threats," I explained, picking up a laser pointer from the podium. Its red dot danced on the screen. "When I acquired the deed to Lot 34, I also acquired every right that was originally attached to it. These are called appurtenant rights. They travel with the land, forever. And this particular property came with a very special one. I traced the red line with the laser. It started at the edge of my new property, Lot 34. Then it crossed, a boundary line. It cut a straight, merciless path 50 feet wide, right through the middle of the adjacent lot, right through a parcel labeled Lot 32. In 1988, 3 years before this HOA was even a bad idea, the developer granted a permanent and irrevocable ingress, egress, and utility easement to the owner of Lot 34. An easement, for those who don't know, is a legally binding, unbreakable right for one property owner to cross through another's property for the purposes of access. I moved the laser dot across the map, tracing the red line over an outline of a house, over a kidney-shaped pool, and across a perfectly manicured front lawn. This easement gives me, the new owner of Lot 34, the legal right to, if I so choose, bulldoze a 50-foot wide road right through the center of Lot 32 to access my property. I let the laser dot come to a rest right on the house number printed on the map, which is owned by Ronald and Brenda Mae Thompson. A collective gasp, louder than any before, filled the room. Someone in the back just whispered, "Oh, my God." Brenda followed the red dot. I watched her mind process the impossible truth. Her prize-winning rose bushes, her perfectly manicured lawn, the one she used as a benchmark to terrorize her neighbors. Her kingdom. I now owned a legal path to drive a dump truck straight through it. She made a small, wounded sound and collapsed back into her chair, her face the color of ash. All the fight, all the venom, drained out of her in an instant. She was a hollowed-out shell. Todd Hemlock, her legal shark, stared at the map, then looked at the copy of the deed I'd placed on the podium. He saw the legal descriptions. He saw the recorded easement number. He knew it was over. Without a word to his client, he began, slowly packing his leather briefcase, the soft clicks of the latches sounding like the closing of a coffin. A woman in the back of the room, Maria Garcia, stood up. "I make a motion to remove Brenda Thompson as president of the Whispering Pines HOA, effective immediately." "Second!" yelled a dozen voices at once. Someone called the question. It wasn't even a vote. It was a roar, a primal scream of liberation from every person who had ever received a condescending letter, an unjust fine, or a threatening glare. It was unanimous. Brenda didn't even vote. She just stared blankly at the map on the screen, a map of her own spectacular ruin. In the chaotic aftermath, George Henderson was nominated as interim president. The motion passed with a round of thunderous applause and a standing ovation. Power had been returned to the people. A month later, the world felt different. The air in Whispering Pines, which had been thick with suspicion and fear, now smelled of freedom. It smelled like the honeysuckle on my old fence and the rich soil in George's tomato garden. I was out back, inspecting the old workshop, my father sitting on the porch in his favorite chair, a placid smile on his face. He was watching the Garcia's 5-year-old daughter, who was laughing, soaring toward the sky on a brand-new bright green swing set. It had been the first item, approved by the new board. George walked over from his yard, a large, impossibly red tomato in his hand. "From the first harvest," he said, handing it to me. It was warm from the sun, heavy in my palm. It felt like a trophy. Peace in our time. We stood there for a moment, just watching the neighborhood come back to life. The reign of beige was over. Colorful flags, wind chimes, and creative garden gnomes were starting to appear on lawns. People were talking to each other over their fences again. Brenda and her husband had put their house up for sale the week after the meeting. There was no bidding war. They took the first lowball offer and were gone, the moving truck a final silent admission of their defeat. The city had sent a formal letter dropping its code compliance inquiry, citing a clerical error. I looked at my father's workshop, a structure that had once been a symbol of defiance and now was just a part of our home. A home I had almost lost, a home I had fought for not with anger, but with facts. Bullies like Brenda thrive on emotion and intimidation. They build empires of fine print and fear, but their foundations are always hollow. All it takes is one person with a map, a library card, and the will to trace the lines back to the truth. You don't have to be a soldier or a surveyor to do it. You just have to believe that no one is above the law and that a community, united, is the most powerful force there is. If you believe that too, hit that subscribe button, because we are going to take down every corrupt HOA, one story at a time. This wasn't just my victory, it's a blueprint for yours. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror story below, and let's expose them together. Like this video, and share it with anyone who needs to be reminded that the little guy can and should fight back. The more people who know how to do this, the harder it will be for them to get away with it. Now, if you want to see another insane HOA takedown, click the video on your screen. You won't believe what happened next.